Thank you again. Let's all be seated. And with hope for strength, insight, and blessing, let us turn to Acts chapter 22. We conclude that chapter and hope that all of us are appreciative of the progress that God has given us through this book. 22 chapters of Acts is an accomplishment that you have made, and this will conclude that chapter today, verses 22 through 30. Remember that Paul has asked the Roman tribune and his troops who have rescued him from a vengeful mob. Paul has addressed them in Aramaic, and when he comes to the word Gentile, there is an uproarious and hateful response. We'll talk much about that word Gentiles in just a moment. But our reading is from Acts chapter 22, verse 22 through 30. They listened to him up to this statement. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth. He should not be allowed to live." They were crying out, throwing off their cloaks, tossing dust into the air. The commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander. "What are you about to do?" he said. "This man is a Roman." The commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money." But Paul said, "I was actually born a citizen." Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. The commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble. He brought Paul down and set him before them. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of the sacred book. Well, there had been a hush over the crowd when Paul spoke in the native vernacular of Aramaic. It almost seemed to say to them, "I too am a Jewish resident of Jerusalem." Then they accorded him mild attention and quiet, quite phenomenally, and to the relief of the Roman tribune and his troops who had rescued him from the vengeful mob. But in Paul's speech, he must include the fact that when he saw the Lord on the road to Damascus, and when he was commissioned, both by Christ and later in the words of Ananias, God had sent him to the Gentiles. And when Paul mentions the word Gentiles, there is, as I have said, an eruption of hostility and murderous hatred. It is a protest and a state of indignation of which we read in verses 22 and 23. Apparently gesticulating wildly, throwing dust into the air, flinging off their coats, they cry out for the death of Paul, the Roman prisoner. But it is the word Gentile that sets off this demonstration of lustful hatred. However, for most Christians reading this text, they assume that the word Gentiles provokes the mayhem because the word Gentiles speaks of an undermining or an eroding of Jewish privileges in the sight of God. In other words, Gentiles raises an acute theological reason for their indignation and protest. It is true that Paul is spoken of as one who has denigrated ancestral traditions, has admitted to the covenant people of God, Gentiles, without the necessary rite of circumcision. And so certainly there is much theological indignation when Paul mentions that he has been sent with the good news to the Gentiles. But we have to spend the next moments together understanding that the word Gentiles does not provoke such hostility because of theological contradiction alone, but because of a rabid, intense, and inflammable Jewish political nationalism. So let's talk about, for these next moments, what it meant to be a Jewish nationalist and why the word Gentiles provokes not only theological disagreement, but in the climate of the AD 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, it is political indignation and military concern that is attached to the word Gentiles. Let's relax for a moment and go back many centuries. Remember that after the divided monarchy, that is, after the reigns of David and Solomon, for most of Israel's history, she has been under the thumb, militarily and politically, of Gentile nations. We can name them quite readily and easily: Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, following Alexander, the division of his kingdom among the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids, the military heirs of Alexander, ruled over Judea and provoked great hostility as Greek Gentiles lauded their superiority over especially Jerusalem, profaned the altar of God, sought to bring Hellenism, that is, the Greek way of life, to the city of Jerusalem and Judea, forbade circumcision, and vigorously persecuted those who sought to adhere to Judaism and the ancestral customs. But then, you may be familiar with it, in the 2nd century, under the leadership of the Maccabees, a Jewish family, the Jewish people threw off the Gentile yoke of the Seleucids, and for more than a century, they established an independent nation, often called the Hasmonean dynasty. They were able to appoint their own high priest. They were able to extirpate from Judea, and especially Jerusalem, the ways of Hellenism and Greek paganism. And for a while, long decades, moving into more than a century, they desired and sought a reestablishment of the Davidic kingdom. Yes, Jerusalem would once again be the capital of a nationalistic Jewish state, independent of control by the hated Gentiles. But something happened in the 60s BC. Pompey the Great invaded Syria, and he also invaded Judea. He captured Jerusalem and took thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews captive and sold them into slavery. You and I read the New Testament and hear a lot about Herod the Great, but remember that Herod the Great was only a puppet client king of the Romans. It was the might and fist of Rome that gave Herod his power. And now, at the time at which this incident occurs, apparently the spring of AD 57, this would put us approximately 25 years after the resurrection. Jewish nationalism has grown into a furious and fever pitch. One of the reasons is the Romans looked down upon, found contemptible the Jewish people. They were peculiar. They were, in the eyes of many, misanthropic. That is, they hated mankind, apparently because of their separation from the nations. And they mistreated the Jews terribly and taxed them mercilessly. Not only so, there were incidents that Josephus, the Jewish historian, records, such as a Roman soldier exposing himself in the temple during worship to show the Romans complete contempt for that narrow Jewish way of life. So there is hostility from the Romans, crippling taxation, mistreatment, mismanagement, and misgovernment. Even Pontius Pilate in AD 36, long after the years of Jesus, was removed for mismanaging the Jewish province of Judea and Galilee. And so there is intense dislike and hatred for the Roman people, and there is a sense that Jews will revolt against Rome, take on the might of the city on the Tiber, and once again, a Hasmonean dynasty perhaps not, but once again, they will be independent and free from the hated Romans. And this is the culture and manner in which the Jews were living, literally on the edge, or what we might say, the water has long since been boiling. Now, I want to give one example. Time constraints prevented us from developing chapter 21 and verse 38 when we covered that chapter. I do and am mindful of time constraints, and that particular week, I felt there was not time to detail the incident found in Acts 21:38. That is where the Roman tribune asks Paul, "Aren't you the Egyptian that led 4,000 assassins into the wilderness?" And we simply passed over an explanation that I give now. The unidentified Egyptian false prophet was playing to the strongly insurrectionist, nationalistic Jewish hopes, and the word assassins is not the word assassin. It is a word that comes from the Latin language, sicari. And it's translated assassins, I think quite accurately, but the word sicari refers to a short dagger. And there were a group of individuals beyond the zealots who were called sicari because they carried under their cloaks a sicar, a short dagger. And during the governorship of Felix. He is now, in this chapter which we're reading, the governor of Judea, just as Pilate was more than 20 years earlier. Felix tried to stamp out these nationalist zealots, Sicarii, because they would go into the crowded marketplace, even the court of the Gentiles. They would remove the sicar, the short dagger, from their cloaks, and they would run through anyone who was viewed as a compromiser with Rome. Anyone who was sympathetic to Rome. They took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lives. Josephus writes about them in his Jewish history. They were known to be a part of the culture. And the NIV, a version from which I usually read each week in addition to others, translates the word not assassins, but terrorists. So, in the environment of this flaring up of murderous hatred against Paul, it is not simply theological dislike or disagreement. It is not just about circumcision. It is about a whole populace that has as an example of the kind of conduct that was going on, these men about whom the Roman commander is speaking and referring to them as assassins. There were, according to him, 4,000 of them willing to follow this Egyptian false prophet and take on Rome. One other fact, and we'll return to chapter 22 and pick up with the commander in verse 24. And that is this: we are only 8 years away from the Jewish war against Rome. Again, many Christians know one date: the temple was destroyed in AD 70. But the war broke out not in AD 70, but finally came to bloodshed in AD 66. We are almost in 58. So we are only 8 years away from all of the nationalist Jews and all of those living in Judea and Galilee rising up and literally taking on the world's supreme superpower, Rome. And by the way, initially they had some success and were confident somehow that they would overthrow the hated Roman Gentile rule and restore Judea and Jerusalem to the days of David. So what is taking place now is not simply theological disagreement. Paul is talking about negating the privilege of circumcision. He is talking to an audience that loathes the Roman oppressive rule, and sympathy with Rome, such as going to Gentiles with the message of Abraham's promise, was viewed as an enormous, more than a compromise, but as a decision to in fact undermine the entire case for Jewish nationalism and independence. Paul did not mention in verse 21 that he was a Roman citizen, because when the tribune arrests him and Jews are plentifully surrounding him, the last thing Paul wants to say then is, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't arrest me without warrant. This would have set the crowd off all the more. See, we told you, he's not only complicit with the Gentiles, he's complicit with the hated Romans who are taxing us, who loathe our religion, who are seeking to transform our culture into Hellenism and the ways of paganism. And this Paul not only is a theological defection from proper Judaism, but he is also an affiliate of Rome, a very citizen of our hated enemies. And so Paul simply says to the to the tribune there earlier in chapter 1, he simply says, I'm a citizen of Tarsus, no mean city. But now we find out why Paul does reveal to the tribune that he is a Roman citizen. But he does so in the privacy of the barracks. Because when Paul mentions the word Gentile, the crowd goes into an uproar about which we read in verses 22 and 23. And the tribune realizes, Chiliarch is another name for him, commander of 1,000, the fortress of Antonio at the northwest corner of the temple, court of the Gentiles. This is the residence for the garrison of the Roman troops. Paul is on the steps into those barracks, and now the tribune, along with his men, take Paul inside the barracks where they are safe from the madding crowd. I might mention how blessed we are, despite our nation's current malaise and declension, how blessed we are to have so many constitutional protections. At least they are written down, if not followed. But one of them would be that we could not be tortured in interrogation. We would have to have a trial of our peers, and we would not be permitted to suffer torture to gain an accurate rendition of an account or an episode in which we were involved. That was not the case in Rome. And so the tribune decides to do what Rome often did. He decides to string Paul up with thongs, is the word that is used in verse 25. Verses 24 and 25 refer to this. We are making progress. And in verses 24 and 25, he simply orders standard operating procedure. String the prisoner up, the arrested man up with thongs, and administer a scourging. And under the duress and pain of scourging, he will reveal the reason that the Jews are clamoring for his life. It says there, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. The last phrase of verse 24. So he's simply doing what most Roman commanders or tribunes or chiliarchs would do. He's ordering interrogation by torture. There are 3 kinds of scourging mentioned in the New Testament, and it's important to differentiate between them to understand why Paul does what he does. The first Paul refers to, for example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 24. He refers to the fact that the Jews had beaten him 5 times with lashes. This is a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 1 through 3, where corporal punishment is prescribed for certain offenses under the Mosaic law. The individual was to lie down, he could be beaten, but not more than 40 lashes, lest you humiliate your brother. And that's where we get the expression 40 minus 1. They often lashed the prisoner or the one found guilty in court 39 times to make sure they didn't exceed the optimum amount under the Mosaic law, sort of a pious nodding of the head to the restriction to 40 lashes. Paul tells us, if you have any interest in thinking about the persecution that he suffered for Christ, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24, that he suffered at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes 5 times. So these episodes about which we have read in his previous missionary years, those years are now concluded. We're in a different phase of his life. But during those missionary years, perhaps all the way back to Cilicia in the silent years, there had been 5 occasions when Paul received 40 lashes from the Jews. Secondly, I said there were three means of scourging. The second was what we saw for ourselves at Philippi in chapter 16 of the book of Acts. This is to be beaten with lictor rods, Lictor. The lictor rods were rods that Roman authorities carried as symbols of their authority. And at times, they would use those lictor rods to administer a beating for a relatively mild offense. So if you remember, in chapter 16, Paul cast out the demon from the girl who was a soothsayer, and her owners took Paul and Silas to the authorities, declared them to be Jews, having customs unlike Romans, and these Roman authorities just respond immediately by having Paul and Silas beaten with lictor rods. And in verse 25 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, it tells us that on three occasions, one of which we know from Philippi in Acts 16, on three occasions, Paul was beaten with lictor rods. Neither of these, the Jewish lashes of Deuteronomy 25, the lictor rods of Acts chapter 16, neither of these was in any ordinary sense lethal. But the scourging to which the Roman commander refers here could cripple a man for life, could indeed prove fatal. It is the word that is used, flagellum, it is the word that is used for the scourging which Jesus received before his crucifixion, as recorded in the Gospels. And though the instrument of scourging was constructed in several different ways, the ordinary instrument of inflicting this scourging was a stout, strong wooden handle with long leather thongs extended from it and connected to it, and then jagged pieces of bone and metal knotted into the leather. And a centurion, as here, would be assigned a detail of soldiers. They would strip the victim of his clothes, and a powerfully strong Roman soldier was selected, and he would, with all his might, use that flagellum to rake the back of the one who was to be scourged. And the bone and the metal, the jagged bone and metal, would do more than lacerate. It would completely rip the flesh off the back of the individual. So we find Jesus, for example, trying to carry the wooden beam of his cross, but due to the loss of blood from this kind of scourging, he stumbles and falls. And so they impress Simon, coming in from the country, to carry his cross. This was a vicious, torturous, cruel, and often lethal means of getting a man to tell the truth, among other things. But it was forbidden for a Roman citizen to be scourged. And so Paul, while out amidst the Jews, did not admit he was a Roman citizen. When they stretch him out, strip what's left of his clothing from his back, tie him with thongs, Paul knows that what is coming is not just lictor rods and is not just the lashes from a Jewish adversary, but he is going to be scourged, perhaps to death, by this flagellum. And so Paul does, thankfully, what any sane-minded individual will do. There are no Jews there to hear it, and if there were, he probably still would have played his trump card. He said, "Is it legal for you to scourge a Roman, one who has been unexamined?" In other words, not only was he a Roman and therefore scourging was illegal, but they had not even examined him. In fact, in point of fact, legally, a Roman citizen was not allowed to be chained without an examination and a charge. So we'll find in just a moment that not only is the centurion who hears this alarmed, but the commander is alarmed. And we read, as we continue our progress, in verse 26, the centurion hears this. He goes to the commander. The commander in verse 27 comes and says, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And Paul answers in the affirmative. Now, a curious reader is going to ask a question or two. The first is, how does the victim, potential victim in this case Paul, verify that he is a Roman citizen? Could he not just claim to be one and thereby escape the scourging? The answer is possibly, but the consequences for making a false claim were severe and certainly would be found out. There are a number of ways that Paul could authenticate his Roman citizenship. The usual means would be to consult the records in Tarsus, or perhaps, because we learned last week he was brought up in Jerusalem, perhaps it was recorded in Jerusalem. Perhaps Paul knew that as well and was ready to make that claim to the Roman commander. The third way was not only your native city or the adopted city would record that citizenship, but often, I don't know if it's often, I can't say historically that it's often, but many times a citizen would carry what was called a diptych. And a diptych was simply two pieces of wood on which the citizenship was inscribed, and the diptych actually refers to the two sides of wood that are held together by a hinge. And so it's simply a small, what was called a diptych, and the word has come down to us, I think it would surprise you, the word has come down to us as diploma. It was called a diploma, and it was a diptych that opened and carried the credentials of citizenship for one who was indeed a citizen of Rome. The likelihood is that Paul, some individuals carried this with what we might call a necklace, something around their neck, and the diptych would hang from their neck. We just don't read anywhere in the New Testament of Paul having that, and it's impossible to say whether or not he might have had it on this occasion. Perhaps that's improbable, but those are the reasons for which the Roman centurion appears to have taken Paul at his word. But then he makes this statement, which brings up our second question. He says, "This citizenship I too have," but he says in verse 28, "It cost me a large sum of money." And this man's name, chapter 23, the next chapter will tell us, is Claudius Lysias. And when an individual was enfranchised, that is to say, granted citizenship in the Roman Empire, that individual often took the name of the emperor. We are not in the age of the Republic, we're in the age of the empire. And when an individual, again, was enfranchised under an emperor, he often took the emperor's name. So his name, Claudius Lysias, tells us that apparently under Claudius, he was able to purchase his citizenship. Historical records tell us that there was a large scandal under Claudius in which citizenship privileges were sold for magnificent sums of money. You gave money to an administrator, he would put your name on a list of enfranchisement, and if the money was sufficient, the emperor would grant the citizenship. And this appears to be what is being said in verse 28 by Claudius. He's looking there at a begrimed, half-naked, hair tousled, bleeding individual, And he is saying, somewhat in exasperation, it cost me a lot of money to be a citizenship. Look at you. How did you get to be a citizen? Paul said, I was born a citizen. In the providence of God, we don't know how Paul's father and perhaps his grandfather became a Roman citizen. And so when Paul was born, in the great providence of God, he was born a Roman citizen. And this is going to be at large throughout the whole rest of the book. And Luke is saying to the readership, this man is a born citizen of Rome, the world superpower, and the one over whom Caesar presides. Paul is a legitimate Roman citizenship. And so the rest of the paragraph, verse 29, tells us that the tribune is afraid because this man that he was about to scourge against Roman law, he had already put him in chains, which was a violation, but this was a man whom he was legally charged to protect. The soldiers were to protect Roman citizens. And so rather than being someone to be scourged perhaps to the point of death and interrogated by torture, he actually was the tribune's responsibility to protect him not only from the mob that sought to kill him on 2 occasions, but from any punishment meted out in the courts and the discretion of Rome. So he is, in a sense, mortified. He's got a problem on his hands. And it says here, the commander also was afraid, verse 29, when he found out that he was a Roman and because he had put him in chains. Now, only for a second, a slight bit of news that many people ask about. How did Paul's father become a Roman citizen? And the short answer is we don't know. But as with so many other questions about the Bible, people want to know. So there is speculation. I'll give two short explanations. First, when someone rendered superior service to the emperor or to a consul or to the Roman people, they were often awarded citizenship. And some have speculated that Paul's father was a leather worker, and under either Pompey the Great or Mark Antony, he had done great service to those men's armies by providing tents for them, and thus those generals and consuls bestowed upon Paul's father citizenship as a reward for magnanimous and helpful service to their legions. That is a theory that appears. The second one is, I've mentioned Pompey in the 60s BC conquering Rome and enslaving many, many thousands. But a quirky, is that okay? Quirky? A Roman law that is sort of a quirk of jurisprudence was that if a Roman citizen owned a slave and freed that slave also, at the point of manumission or freedom, that slave became a freed man. And there were literally tens of thousands of freedmen in Rome who had been freed, though once they had been captured and enslaved. And many of these freedmen went on to be wealthy participants in the Greco-Roman world of the first century. So it's very common. And so some speculate that when Pompey conquered Jerusalem, his father was a Pharisee apparently, and apparently Paul's father is captured, brought into Cilicia as a slave. Later, his freedom is given him, he's manumitted, and as a result of being the slave of a Roman citizen, he obtains Roman citizenship. Those are the two leading theories, but the bottom line is that we don't know. We do know that Jerome, a church father, says that Paul's father was a Galilean. And when he saw that war with Rome was inevitable, he left and went to Cilicia. So those are numbers of ideas about how Paul's father became a Roman citizen. But whatever the case, the bottom line that Luke is communicating to his readers is, in the providence of God, this man now who is going to appear before consecutively Felix, the current governor, then Festus, who replaces him, then the Jewish king, the younger Agrippa, and then eventually, apparently, though outside of the jurisdiction of the book of Acts ends before Paul's death, he appears perhaps before Caesar himself. Why? Because of this incident that Luke has been careful to record, mimicking what we learned in chapter 16, that Paul is a Roman citizen and thus entitled to the rights and the protection of the empire. Now we're home. This poor man, Claudius Lysias. Claudius probably means he bought his way onto the enfranchisement list under Claudius. By the way, Claudius' successor was Nero. And Nero started off auspiciously and favorably and cleaned up the scandal of Claudius and began to make demands for citizenship. But the name Claudius Lysias signifies that this man was, in fact, a part of purchasing his citizenship. The word Lysias is a Greek name, so he's from the East. There aren't many Roman citizens in the East in the first century. So this really startles this poor man, Claudius Lysias. But he goes from bewilderment to utter exasperation to fear now. And so his decision that is recorded in verse 30 and concludes our time together, his decision is, I can't put him before a mob. They are not coherent. They're not going to give a cogent reason for his arrest. But I have to report to Felix why I, as the leading Roman military official in Jerusalem at the time of the Feast of Pentecost, I have to give an account to Felix for why this man has been imprisoned. And so his deduction is, I'll call the high priest and the Sanhedrin, and I'll have them, surely they will know, and I will have them explain to me why this man is being vigorously persecuted unto death by the Jewish people. And so verse 30 tells us he did not delay. This man has been more than a problem to him. He's misidentified him 3 times. He's almost lost the feather in his cap of officership, because surely had he beaten Paul, he would have been demoted or perhaps exchequered right out of the military itself. So he is eager not only to have another bring charge against Paul, but to get Paul out of his jurisdiction and up to the procurator or the governor, who is Felix. Felix is, in this episode, what Pontius Pilate was 25 years earlier in the Jesus of Nazareth episode. So Felix is in Caesarea, and next week we're going to see that the Sanhedrin come together, they disagree, and with a great sigh of relief, Claudius Lysias sends a letter to Felix and says, I don't have a charge to bring against this man, but I'm sending him to you. So Felix will take up the case in weeks ahead. But this is the stage for all of this is set by this critically important episode in which Luke is bringing to our attention that though Paul will be under arrest 2 years in Caesarea and 2 years in Rome, he is under the protective custody of Rome because he was born a Roman citizen. And so God protects Paul, and so God protects us. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for what for us is the effort to understand a historical narrative that Luke is using to instruct us, his readers, about the days and years to come when Paul will be treated as a Roman citizen. And eventually it will appear that, like Jesus and like Peter, Paul eventually will be executed by the power of Rome. Lord, help us to commit ourselves to you, that in this wicked and evil age in which we live, we, our church, and our families may be protected by the providence of God. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.